Good morning. I am George Martin, and I have the honor of serving as the chair of the Governing Council for the Miller Center. So I want you to turn to your neighbor and say, "Neighbor, welcome to the Miller Center's Conference on the American Presidency." So thank you so much for being with us. This is an exciting couple of days for us, and I know the staff has been preparing diligently for this, and we're all excited. So we have our first presidential conference 2 years ago in October, and that was a tremendous success, and there was quite an uproar in terms of the need for a second conference. And we're not going to put any pressure on Bill, but gosh, it sure would be nice to start planning a third one. So over the past couple of decades, by the numbers in terms of benchmarks, presidents have grown more powerful, more partisan, and less popular. We have assembled scholars here today, practitioners, journalists, to discuss these trends. But not to just discuss the trends, we also want to talk about solutions. At the Miller Center, we believe that thoughtful dialogue can produce meaningful solutions. For the Miller Center, assembling this group has been, for this challenge, is the most fitting way to celebrate our 50th anniversary. Can you believe that? 50 years. I was just a child when then. But our mission 50 years ago, and in fact, the Miller Center first opened its doors on September the 1st, 1975. Our mission is to explore how the American presidency meets national priorities and to engage scholars with leading citizens to help solve those major problems. So we are well known for exploring the room where it happens. And I like to believe that the Miller Center is also the room where it happens because of you and others who have assembled in this place. Our oral history team has conducted more than 800 interviews with senior officials from every administration since Gerald Ford. And we thank many of those officials, some of whom are here today, for their participation. Our presidential recordings program transcribes and annotates the secret White House tapes that were recorded by presidents going back as far as Franklin Roosevelt. We have published more than 600 hours and 5,000 transcripts of these unique recordings. Our scholars use this vast archive and practitioner network to help illuminate the presidency and address national priorities. Through policy research, task force, national commissions, we work in a nonpartisan way to advance policy and governance solutions. Here again, the emphasis on solutions. The conference themes, executive power, partisanship, and public trust, connect with our principles of the American Constitution. So James Madison, who's one of my favorite founding fathers, and as many of you know, he served on the Board of Visitors at the University of Virginia and also served as the rector at the university, was one of the authors of the essays that compiled the Federalist Papers, and he primarily focused on separation of powers, and Hamilton focused primarily on the presidency. But in writing the Federalist Papers, in Federalist number 51, Madison said, "Ambition must be made to counteract ambition." So Madison reminds us that energy in the executive is essential, and also that it must be balanced by the interests and needs of the legislature and the court. In the separation and sharing of powers that preserves liberty and prevents overreach. So finally, our founding fathers had a vision that we are seeing today, and obviously they had tremendous vision. And of course, here at the University of Virginia, we are extremely proud of one of our founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson. And I think Thomas Jefferson would be proud of what we're doing today. And the only negative thing I think that Thomas Jefferson would say about the Miller Center is that it wasn't his idea. So recent weeks, we've seen political violence, we've seen debate at an unprecedented level of division. Jefferson himself said in his first inaugural address every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. Or as Lincoln said in his first inauguration, we are not enemies, but friends. Though passion may have strained, they must not break our bond of affection. So again, welcome. I think we're going to have 2 exciting days, and at this time I'd like to call on Paul Mahoney, interim president of our great university.
Thank you, George, for that welcome. I'd also like to thank the Governing Council and Bill Antholis for inviting me to be with you this morning. Thanks also to the Miller Center faculty and fellows from across UVA who've played key roles in shaping this conference, especially Mark Silverstone, Rachel Potter, and Sid Milkus. And we're also grateful to have UVA alumni involved in the conference, including Don Bayer, Kate Bedingfield, Mary V. Cannell, Tom Donnellan, and Mark Short, just to name a few. We have very good Wahoo representation today. Today marks not only an important conversation, but an opportunity to shine a light on the legacy of the Miller Center's 50 years at the University of Virginia. In that time, the Miller Center has become the go-to source for scholarly research, public discussion, and resources about the American presidency. My academic field is financial regulation, and in that capacity, I had the great fortune to participate in the Center's oral history project about the 2007 to 2009 financial crisis. But I first became aware of the Miller Center much earlier in my time on the UVA faculty. In 1997, Philip Zelikow and a co-author published a book entitled The Kennedy Tapes: Inside the White House During the Cuban Missile Crisis. The book included transcripts and commentary from the White House tapes made during that period. The next year, Philip became the director of the Miller Center and established the Presidential Recordings Program. Now, the Miller Center was well ahead of the curve in making some of these tapes available over the internet. And I can still remember, at a distance of almost 30 years, eagerly devouring some of these recordings and the transcripts that the Miller Center published. And I found them a very deep lesson about leadership. Kennedy's advisors, McNamara, Bundy, Rusk, etc., saw the issue in tactical terms because that was their job. They talked about the resources, military, economic, and diplomatic, available to the US and the Soviets, and how those might optimally be deployed. Kennedy saw the issues in strategic terms because that was his job. If we do this in Cuba, what might the Soviets do in Berlin? How important to us are the intermediate missiles we have in Turkey? As you can see, I was fascinated by these tapes and transcripts, and I know that many others have reacted similarly to other Miller Center programming, which is consistently engaging and eye-opening, as I'm sure today's conference will be. I'm delighted to celebrate the Center's 50th anniversary with this conference. You've chosen a topic of enduring importance. When I was an undergraduate at MIT, Harvard and MIT had a cross-registration arrangement under which students at either school could take certain courses at the other. So I took Richard Neustadt's course on the American presidency at the Kennedy School in, I believe, the spring of 1980. How things have changed in the intervening 45 years. It would be a very different course today. But one question would remain front and center. Is the separation of powers on which our government rests, and about which George spoke, still alive and well, or has that power become too concentrated in the executive? When I took that American presidency course, Republicans were apt to say that the judiciary had usurped too much of the president's authority, and Democrats were apt to say that President Nixon had attempted to exercise too much control over cabinet-level departments and the use of military force. Today, Republicans are apt to say that a permanent bureaucracy within the executive branch has usurped too much of the president's authority, and Democrats are apt to say that President Trump has attempted to exercise too much control over independent agencies. The words have changed, but I can still recognize the tune. For that reason, I look forward to hearing what the extraordinary collection of distinguished academics and practitioners assembled here will say about the landscape of presidential power and leadership at the end of the first quarter of the 21st century. These kinds of conversations have always been important, but they seem especially so in our current moment. As we approach the 250th anniversary of American independence, we must remember how to talk to each other constructively, both at the highest levels of our democracy and in the day-to-day conversations we have here on grounds. I'm grateful to the Miller Center for helping us to have these conversations in a bipartisan, constructive manner, and to all of you for the insights and experiences that you will contribute. Thank you again for being here. I hope you have an enjoyable and fruitful conference. Now I'm delighted to turn the program over to Miller Center Director and CEO Bill Antholis. I should just quickly mention that Bill, like Phil Zelikow, spent time in both the National Security Council and the State Department, and the Miller Center has gone from strength to strength under his extraordinary leadership. Bill.
Well, thank you, Paul and George. It's really terrific to have both of you kicking off our programming today because you're both longstanding friends of the Miller Center. When I interviewed for this job, George was rector of the Board of Visitors, and I interviewed with George. And shortly after arriving, when I arrived, Paul was the dean of the law school, and he was one of the first people I reached out to because part of my hope for the center was it would draw resources as it had over the 40 years before I took over from across the university, and the law school is really one of our strengths. As one can tell from how many law graduates we have in the room, I look around and I see 1, 2, I can keep counting, 3, 4. I'll stop counting because we have as many from Darden, the college, the Batten School, and the other parts of the university. My job today is to do what I'll call elevated housekeeping, but with a little bit of goal setting at the beginning. Over the next 2 days, we'll focus on understanding and improving the modern American presidency, or as George repeated, our strategic priorities laid out 50 years ago by our founders. We explore and we engage. Today and tomorrow in the mornings, we'll have these roundtable discussions. These are problem-solving sessions. People, as Paul well laid out, these issues have been deemed problems in American history going back to the founding era. And yet people from both sides of the aisle tend to take similar positions as they have in the past, yet with nuances and concerns, and sometimes people crossing across party lines to take different positions. And we want to hear that both to understand where we are in the presidency, but if we have a problem, how do we get to solving it? And we'll hear a number of recommendations over the course of the next 2 days, and we'll look to this group to see if they're actionable and what a group like this and others can do to affect it. So today we have 2 roundtable discussions on what we call democracy and bureaucracy, and tomorrow we have 2 roundtables on sharing powers. Democracy and bureaucracy looks at how democratically elected presidents, but also democratically elected Congresses, shape the relationship between the branches, and what a democratically elected president can then do with a standing bureaucracy that was created by acts of Congress signed into law by the president. Tomorrow's roundtables are on sharing powers, how it actually works or doesn't work, particularly between the president and Congress, but also the role of the courts. Then tonight we'll move into a different format. Rather than being obsessed, or as one colleague here has regularly said, rather than falling in love with problems, we'll look at examples of presidential leadership. Our law school and our business school are leaders in using cases, the case study method. And we'll look at 2 cases of success, one from President Bush 43's administration, the PEPFAR initiative, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which saved 25 million lives. And then we'll look at President Obama's led effort to find and bring to justice Osama bin Laden. Those start at 5 p.m. at the Rotunda. For people coming in person, we ask you to arrive early because we're expecting a big crowd. So turning to the first roundtable, I want to thank a few people. First, our governing council, in particular our chair, George Martin, and our vice chair, Tricia Heffling. Tricia, where are you? Raise a hand. Please make sure to thank them as well. This is something that they have paid attention to for the last 2 years since our first panel, when Steve Burns, our previous chair, led us into this work, and we're so appreciative of that leadership. I also want to thank Mary V. Cannell, a governing council member who chairs our Presidential Studies and Policy Research Committee. And this is one of those topics that we have spent a lot of time on in refining the program. I want to thank Josh Bolton and Tom Donilon, who have served as co-chairs of this effort. Last night in talking to a few friends, they asked, are you assembling the best people on these topics? And I can't think of any 2 better than Josh and Tom, and we're really honored to have them and have their real engagement. And thanks for the many hours that they've spent on Zooms and conversations of one kind or another, recommending people, asking if we're following up on key topics. They're really engaged, and we couldn't be more appreciative. And then finally, our whole team. I can't thank everyone, but I really want to start with those 2 people in the back, Kelsey Millay and Mike Greco. Kelsey is the Associate Director of Presidential Studies. Mike heads up the terrific AV team. Those in the room, there are at least 7 cameras staring at you of our own, and I think a few from a partner. They do a terrific job. And then also Reed Forbes, who I don't see in the room, but when you're getting a sandwich or a drink, she oversees all of our events, particularly the catering. And for those Greeks in the room, there's nothing more important than catering. Finally, I want to thank George Marcus, who inspired this conference. He is our principal supporter for this effort. The 50th anniversary, which we'll celebrate over these 2 days, has many supporters, but this conference was in many ways George's idea. He prompted us to say, what are we doing to make the presidency more both accountable and effective, responsible and effective? And George has challenged us with patriotism and concern about our institutions and a focus on practical, actionable ideas, and if we have some, finding a way to do something with them. And George, thank you for your inspiration. He also has 2 great restaurants. Talk to Kelly McCaskill if you want reservations. So now to our first panel on democracy and bureaucracy. To kick off the conversation, I'm delighted to introduce John Yang, the anchor of PBS News Weekend and a national correspondent for the PBS NewsHour. John follows these issues very carefully. We tried 2 years ago to get him. We didn't try far enough in advance. He's promised out many, many months in advance, but we're really delighted to have gotten him this year. He'll lead the conversation for all of these sessions. We've empowered our moderators. We've given them a set of background reading materials, as we have the other panelists. All of those reading materials are available online for our home audience. We encourage you to find them on our website, as well as the longer biographies for all of our panelists. John will briefly introduce the panel and get right at it. And with that, I thank you all for joining us, and I turn it over to John.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, George. I must admit, even though I'm the one leading this conversation, there is so much expertise and experience around this table. I distinctly feel like I'm in a college seminar, and I haven't done the reading. But to quickly introduce the The panel, starting at that end, Guian McKee, who is the White Burkett Miller Professor of Public Affairs here at the Miller Center. Shalonda Young, who was the OMB Director under the Biden administration. Andy Rudalevich, the Thomas Brackett Reed Professor of Government at Bowdoin, and also a senior fellow here at the Miller Center. Rachel Potter, who is at the UVA Politics Department, right? And last but not least, Josh Bolton, who was OMB Director for Bush 43 and also held a number of other positions in that administration, and also in 41's administration, as I believe. Let's start right off with the practical, sort of the how this works in action. I'd like to start with you, Josh and Shalonda. And just because it has to be arbitrary, Josh, why don't you start, since it's in chronological order? But what did you see, or how did you try to make the role of OMB in your administration?
Well, first, John, thank you for moderating here, and Bill, thank you for all that you've done to bring us together, and George Marcus, thank you for underwriting the whole thing. You know, I did not want to be OMB director.
He's told me this.
I was happily ensconced as White House Deputy Chief of Staff, and my predecessor, Mitch Daniels, just a brilliant individual who was a great budget director, but was leaving the administration to run for governor of Indiana, which he did successfully for 8 years. He, after a couple of years, he had said, I'm going to go run, and as deputy chief of staff, it was my job to go tell the president who the chief of staff and I would be recommending. The president said, oh, well, yeah, come for lunch today. By the way, if anyone's ever experienced lunch with George W. Bush, it is not an elegant experience. It's very often he was finished before my food arrived. But it was an opportunity for a candid conversation. I laid out the several people I thought would be impressive budget directors. And I had a couple of choices from Capitol Hill, which Shalonda will confirm is a natural place of experience to put a budget director. And the president listened, heard the names, and said, well, what about you? And this came as a shock. And I mean, what you should say when the president says that, oh, Mr. President, I'm not worthy, but I will serve wherever you want. And I just blurted out, no. And he said, why not? And I said, well, I'm not mean enough. And he said, of course you are. And the next day I went in and said, oh, Mr. President, I'm not worthy, but of course I'll serve wherever you want. And here's the reason I'm telling that story, because the perspective I had at that time about being the budget director was you got to know a lot about the budget. And it's really complicated, both substantively and politically. And I didn't really have that background. I mean, I'd worked on Capitol Hill. I was the policy director of the Bush campaign, so on, but I didn't really understand the budgeting process. And I thought I was ill qualified for the job. In that respect, I was, but in another respect, I think I was well qualified for the job. That doesn't mean I did a good job, but I was well qualified for it because at its essence, What OMB does is reflect the president's priorities through the most powerful mechanism that the president has, which is to say what he, and eventually she, is going to spend money on, and where we're going to allocate our resources. And so in that respect, once I got into the job and realized that I was right, I knew nothing about the budget process. But I also realized that there were people around me, almost 500 of them, who knew a whole lot about it and were great public servants, most of them non-political, who were great public servants for Democrats and Republicans. And they could teach me and guide me on most of the intricacies of the budget. But the important thing about OMB is that is the one place where the president really has leverage over how the government operates. And so I settled into the job, got to know people like Shalonda, who really do understand the budget, and I've found that OMB is perhaps the most important place in government. This may be, Bill, the first conference ever on the presidency to start with a panel about OMB. But it's the right place to start.
Shalonda, you came from the Hill. You were in the appropriations.
So a little
committee.
different, yeah, a little different scenario. I started as a civil servant. I was a presidential management fellow. And someone there said, you should focus on budget. And I was like, what? Why would I do that? Young kids come to DC, they want to do policy. I was an idiot, like most 20-something-year-olds. It turns out that's kind of where all roads lead. So I know a little about a lot. I know enough to be dangerous about a lot. Almost nothing doesn't come through OMB. I tell people, and I told people in the Biden administration, some I see today, you can start here or you're going to end here. It's your choice. You want to do, as my mother would say, easy way or hard way. And unlike Josh, while I was the staff director of the House Appropriations Committee, so OMB was like my thing. I go into battle with OMB, so I had lots of ideas. It also helped me with the civil servants. They know their stuff, but I also had to remind them quickly, like, I know it too. And I have opinions about all of it. I'd done some job on the Appropriations Committee for almost 15 years. What I didn't have that Josh had was a relationship with the West Wing. I didn't know how White Houses worked. And that is incredibly, incredibly important. You had lunch with the president. I went in with the president when his nominee was not going to make it, and I was nominated to be number 2. And I had to convince him why he should bump me to number 1. And my reasoning to him was, you have Janet Yellen, you have C.C. Rouse, you have economists like falling out your ears. OMB is the hammer. And the practical person who takes your economic message and your budget and works with Capitol Hill. And the thankfully long-term senator, I think, understood that message. And each president has a different view of how they want their economics team. And certainly when I sat down with Janet Yellen, she said things that just blew my mind I'd never thought about. And then I'd start talking about the Hill, and she's like, no, what now? And I think that was a benefit to have a team who saw, things like the debt limit, which always ends up in modern history being a crisis when we have these conflicts and partisan tensions, having people who can talk to the financial markets and who can go berate their former friends and colleagues into ensuring we don't see the worst calamity. So the place Josh and I agree is OMB is where it's at. Cabinet secretaries, speaking of needing the White House, you go to your colleagues in the White House, your deputy chief of staffs, your chief of staffs. It's always helpful to have chiefs of staff who know OMB. I was lucky to have that, and you go, if they call you, you send them back. Because I think some former OMB directors may have given me the advice is the president needs to have your back. Because if people can go around you and try to set priorities outside of the process, you may as well just throw your hands up and go home. So I had that support from the West Wing, or I would not have been able to do my job. I loved it so much, I stayed the entire 4 years. That's not normal, because it's a burn. It is and I was either pregnant or had a child my entire 4 years there, and it's still a blur. And I want to talk about this 5 years from now to see if I still have the same insight, because I still feel in it in a way I think it's going to take a little while to get out of. And I may have followed Josh's advice. I said, what'd you do when you left? And he's like, I went and taught. I needed a break, and I'm doing a little teaching. And
By the way, when you're talking about taking a break, you don't say I went and taught.
That is true. Good point, Josh. Can I say easily
just a
mental?
word.
Okay, just a word. You didn't tell me that before we got here. But I did follow your advice, and I'm trying my leg in academia and teaching a little bit about the executive branch and this idea of presidents gathering more and more executive power. And I spent a lot of time over 4 years banging my head these executive orders, we spend so much time producing and man hours, you go, but they're going to come down on January 21st. Let's go try to get something passed in Congress. And, Louisa, who led that effort for the Biden administration a long time, presidents are starting to give up on that process. But the problem is, if you do everything by fiat through executive order, the country has no continuity. No bills like the Clean Water Act that last over a generation. So I was probably a different OMB director in as much as I came from the Hill. I'm a Hill person. I saw the benefit in trying to get lasting change through legislation, even if it was difficult. And thankfully had a boss who respected that process too, having been a senator for so long. But all roads lead in and out of that place. It's the small engine that could, but it's the largest office in the executive office of the president. And they have the brain trust. They're there whether you're Democrat or Republican sitting in the presidency.
So we heard the most important place in government, the hammer that to enforce sort of the president's priorities.
And I was mean enough. You don't have to laugh that hard, Louisa.
Andy, your essay is on the history of the OMB. Has it always been this way?
No, and I'm a little daunted trying to sum up 100 years of history in front of two former distinguished directors. But no is the short answer. I mean, it's come a long way since it was created in 1921. This is the Budget and Accounting Act. It's created at an era where deficits are sort of new to the American scene, and people are worried about this. They want to bring in new ideas about business management and create a unified executive budget for the first time in American history. Now, that first Bureau of the Budget, as it was called then, is created in the Treasury Department. It's quite small. It's very dedicated to rooting out government waste and spending. There's even something within the Bureau called the Loyal Order of the Woodpeckers, which was an honor granted to those who did the most pecking out of waste in the government limb, I guess. It's really FDR, as with so many other things, it sort of repurposes this into a presidential agency. He brings it into the executive office of the president, which itself is new in 1939. It expands enormously from about 40 people to more than 700 briefly in World War II, and then down to about the 500, 550 that we still see today, and becomes responsible for lots of the things it does. Just to back out a little bit, OMB obviously does budget presentation, preparation, as well as implementation, which is increasingly important. It does central clearance in terms of sort of peer review of many of the things coming out of the administration, whether that's legislation, testimony before Congress, commentary on enrolled bills, executive orders, these days regulations, and then of course does management, right? It does both sort of general management and trying to implement the president's program and enforce those priorities, and then it does, specialized things that Congress has given it to do over the years, financial management, procurement, and the like. So, it is a big job. It really has become over time, this sort of nerve center, but one that has shifted in its approach. When FDR expanded it, he really wanted to make it, and part of this is the work of the Brownlow Committee, his committee advising him on administrative management. He wanted to make it, as has already been mentioned, careerist, heavily civil service. It has an ethos of what's often called neutral competence, an idea that the presidency is as important as the president, but always with responsive service to whoever is present at the time. And so, that building up of expertise is hugely useful to presidents, but also sometimes frustrating because they're often told that they can't do the kind of thing they want to do, or at least not do it fast. In the Nixon era, right, we see sort of culmination of this frustration. We see the creation of OMB out of the Bureau of the Budget in 1970 with an idea, as John Ehrlichman put it, Nixon's domestic policy staffer. He summed it up really well. What they wanted was, quote, management in the get the secretary to do what the president needs and wants him to do, whether he likes it or not sense, unquote. That's what they're hoping for, much more of a top-down management rather than the sort of bottom-up administrative management that previous presidents, Democrats mostly, had relied on. And so OMB is battered a little bit by Watergate. Impoundment becomes a big flashpoint of that era, seemingly settled at the time, but perhaps not now. We see, of course, the fiscalization of American politics in the 1980s as there's arguments over deficits. People like David Stockman become household names in their leadership there. Dick Darman, his successor. And it accrues sort of these functions as, more of a political animal, if you will, at the top. More political appointees were added after the Nixon reorganization. Certainly there are more political appointees doing jobs that sometimes had been held by careerists, for example, in the general counsel's office and places like that. But I think structurally it would be more or less recognizable. Again, though, how presidents want to use the agency, I think, has changed. It'll be interesting to hear more about that, and we certainly see it very much in the forefront of a lot of the big arguments that are going on now, whether that's about, again, how money is spent that's been appropriated by Congress, the sort of question of politicization, and I think Rachel may talk more about this, and sort of whether or not the civil service model is something the presidents still want. Shifting that, I think, would change OMB quite a lot. And then, again, the broader value of neutral competence in an era where responsiveness and polarization really is not only the norm, but also in some ways weirdly prized.
Talk about the politicization, the ratio between the sort of careerist experts and the political appointees. Rachel, you wrote, your essay was about this. What's the mix now, and what is the effect of having the mix? I think you said there were 500 FTE, full-time employment positions at the OMB now. About 10% of them are political appointees. What's the effect of having that mix like that?
Yeah, well, I think Andy described it best that the value of OMB has historically been this idea of neutral competence, that there's this group of career civil servants who are really technocrats, and I think Josh and Shalonda both kind of referenced that. And so it's 10%, and that's political appointed positions. The other positions are people who serve across administrations. These are career civil servants. I was one of them. I worked, actually Josh was my boss. I don't know if he remembers. I remember.
Yeah, Shalonda would have remembered you.
But I didn't know my colleagues' political affiliation. The culture at OMB and many agencies, right, is not to talk about your politics at work. You do the job. The job is reviewing regulations or preparing budgets. And I think the current pressure on OMB is kind of laid out specifically in Project 2025, where the current administration talks about OMB becoming, and this is not necessarily in rhetoric a huge break, but I think maybe in practice, they talk about it as the keeper of the commander's intent. And right, Josh said the OMB is the place where the president can get his agenda done. It has leverage, and that's always been somewhat true. I think the big shift that's potentially on the horizon is changing the nature of the hiring and firing of career civil servants. So there's been a number of policies floated by the current administration that would make it such that career civil servants could be shifted into political appointee-like agencies. And OMB in particular was, in the first Trump administration, targeted with 68% of the career civil servants shifted into these positions. And so that really could change the tenor of OMB if that happens, right? If this is sort of a more political position, right, are you going to tell the boss the thing they don't want to hear? Are you going to sort of invest long-term in the agency and building institutions within it if you're maybe not going to be there for a while? So I think that is like the biggest thing on the horizon for OMB. And maybe we can talk about other things because there's clearly other big issues, but that's one I think that in sort of what is the institution going to be like in 10 or 15 years, I think that is one of the...
Again, the place where sort of politics and expertise come together and are often debated is in healthcare policy, and you've examined that. Can you talk a little bit about that, about how we've seen it interact over the last several years?
Sure. Thank you, John. That's oversimplification, but I would say that I would divide the answer into two domains of healthcare policy: healthcare finance and public health. And to start with the finance side, I would say that you really, particularly in recent decades, it is absolutely a domain of that kind of neutral expertise that Rachel just talked about. The role of health economists, of policy analysts, is really central to the development and implementation, crucial point there on implementation, of healthcare policy. And I don't mean to say that politics is, of course, absent. It's not. There's always the president's agenda, a larger ideological framework, but ultimately the numbers have to more or less work within the context of the budget, within the context of the overall healthcare system. So you have a layer of that economic expertise, whether it's OMB, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, Domestic Policy Council, really throughout the executive branch and into Congress. Another crucial point, and even outside of the federal government. In healthcare, the role of major economic interests in the field of hospitals, of insurers, all the different actors that come into play when you're talking about 18% of GDP, all of whom possess their own expertise that in one way or another constrains the capacities of the political appointees or even the president. As far as exceptions to that, I would actually go back to 1965 and Lyndon Johnson and the passage of Medicare and Medicaid. This is before you really have this level of development of the administrative state. And in the passage, in the debate over the legislation, President Johnson and the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, Wilbur Mills, who was central to this process, engaged in what I might describe as strategic ambiguity about the long-term costs of Medicare. And they weren't even really thinking about Medicaid until the very end. And I'll just, as an example of this, a phone conversation between LBJ and his new vice president, Hubert Humphrey, on March 6, 1965. LBJ explained that, quote, "I went up $500 million on this health, extra. So don't argue with me. I'll go $100 million or $1 billion on health or education. I don't argue about that any more than I argue about Lady Bird buying flour. You got to have flour and coffee in your house. And on education and health, I'll spend the goddamn money. I may cut back some tanks, but not on health." That's not something that you're going to have today in the area of healthcare policy. No, but the development and the change in that period of 60 years is striking. And the result of this is, on the one hand, you do have an underestimation of the costs, and choices about payment mechanisms, incentives for doctors and hospitals lead to a soaring level of cost just within the 5 years after implementation. On the other hand, and to the point about passing major legislation, you have a major social policy innovation that 2 generations on is still with us.
I want to talk a little bit about that implementation part. Josh and Shalonda, you send up the budget to the Hill. They do what they do to the priorities. How do you implement? How do you make sure that the agencies, the departments are implementing the president's agenda the way he wants to see it? Either one of you.
Well, I know from firsthand experience what I did with the budget on the other side. And Lindsey Graham reminded me, he said, you know, we throw that thing in the trash when you send it out. I go, yes, Senator, I do. There are useful things to have the bureaucracy put priorities down and consolidate and do that process. It's not because you're going to get it. It's because there instills some discipline. If you prioritize everything, you prioritize nothing. That is a hard message to get across to people who waited their entire lives to be secretary of what. And you're like, no. I don't have the luxury to care about one thing. Like the president told me to tell you, this is 1 year of one budget. We're not doing everything. There are political realities to asking for the moon, especially if you know you're not going to get it from the offset. You know, these are political documents. These are values documents. But what they are not are things that are going to be rubber stamped by Congress. For example, I know the Appropriations Committee starts writing the new bill based on the old bill, not the budget, the old bill. That is what their file is, the old bill. So you get very little change. If you look at appropriations bills, you get very little change from one year to the next. So I think where the power at OMB and the presidency is in implementation. As we're finding out critically, there's a lot of flexibility in how Congress gives you money. Norms and being afraid of members of Congress used to keep you from doing stupid things. That's gone. I still had a little fear because they knew my cell phone number and they'd be like, you used to wait for me. But that kept you on the straight and narrow. But turns out, like, the difference between norms and laws, like, we are now quickly coming to grips with what that means. And if you look at spending bills, just like you had, and Lyndon Johnson would have been like, I miss my moment. I miss my moment. You know, that hasn't gone away. This purposeful ambiguity, oftentimes it's because that's all they could agree on. They couldn't agree on anything more specific. I left many negotiating rooms saying, you say what you need to say, and I'm going to say what I need to say. And we will shake hands, and I'm going to go fund the Affordable Care Act, and you act like you had no idea I was going to use that pot of money to do so. The power is in implementation. Using that flexibility, even before this administration, we did it. You know, Congress didn't know when they gave you a funding bill that you were going to have a formula shortage in the country. So you go, hey, career staff, agencies, what we got? Like, what about some of that, COVID balances? How is that written? I need my general counsels to look at. Do I have any flexibility to use that to bring formula from Europe for parents? And turns out we did. We did in Department of Agriculture, Department of Health and Human Services. So using that flexibility on implementation, and then you might get some angry phone calls because you're like, here's my lawyer's opinion. Like, I know you don't like it. And then you risk Congress coming back and putting further limitations on you. That was always the concern. But using the tools you had in the budget process on the implementation side, I thought was much more powerful than the budget formulation. I think it has other benefits, but it wasn't necessarily that you were going to get what you asked for. But using that flexibility, how you need a green climate fund, very important to President Obama. You don't see those words in funding bills. But we had the flexibility in which to make that decision. That meant we couldn't do something else, but we used the flexibility given to do something the president wanted to do.
Josh, how about you?
I think the system works best when, I believe, when the members of Congress can say that budget is going in the trash, but they know that's not completely true, that there's a give and take on both sides. The president always has the option of saying to the Congress, yeah, I'm not going to sign a bill that does not adequately fund Medicare, Medicaid, the PEPFAR program, whatever. And when the Congress is operating properly, which means, as Shalonda herself supervised a couple of times, means actually passing appropriations bills.
Separately?
Separately, yeah. The Congress has gotten out of the habit of that. When 20 years ago, when I served as budget director, they were still occasionally in the habit of passing all the appropriations bills. And that process actually works because it results in a give and take between the president and the Congress, which I think is how the system is not just supposed to operate, but how it operates best, how it produces the best results for the country. Shalonda, the element you didn't talk about was the negotiation with the cabinet itself, and which is quite a scene. Because when the system is working, the president's budget actually does set the parameters of what a cabinet officer is likely to get in the way of funding. And cabinet officers will come to OMB and the White House and say, I have a great initiative. It's going to require an extra $200 million. And we need to find, where in the budget we can ask for this additional money. And by the way, not my budget, somebody else's budget. We need to find that money. And I think that's a super important process, even when it's, as Shalonda said, even when it's not well accepted up on the Hill, it's an important discipline for the administration itself. Shalonda mentioned at the outside the importance of the president and the White House having the OMB directors back. That is critical in that internal budget creating process. And cabinet officers would always feel free to go around the president. So what we did in the Bush administration is we established an appeal mechanism, which I see Chris Liddell, I think you operated something similar in the first Trump administration. And the appeal mechanism was that if a cabinet officer really disagreed with some important element of the allocations that the budget director had provided to that agency, then the cabinet officer could appeal to a committee that included the chief of staff, the vice president, a few of the other senior presidential advisors, and the OMB director. Now, in reality, this committee was controlled by the OMB director, and very few appeals were granted. But it had the effect of preventing the president from being inundated with appeals that he didn't particularly want to be in a position to decide. That I forget what we called the appeal committee, but the appeal committee would have ruled, and then the chief of staff can say to the cabinet officer, now you're free to appeal to the president, but be aware that all of his advisors have reviewed this and rejected your appeal, and most of them would not appeal. And then the president was well empowered to make a sensible decision, sensible defined as whatever the OMB director.
Now, Josh, we didn't do that.
Yeah, I noticed.
Yeah. I always kept some money back, and worked with career staff. Like, what do you think it takes to make the secretary, the deputy secretary happy? And usually in that first pass, I could negotiate my way to not bothering anyone in the West Wing. There are always the few who would not give up. I kept very close eye on who I thought could break through. the West Wing and who couldn't. Some I'm like, good luck. I think I can get around you. There are some, like your defense secretary, who's going to see the president all the time, and he's going to use that opportunity to bring it up. And I beat him, like just, it was just, trying to make your arguments to the boss, and I beat him, and the OMB career staff made me a nice little sign that I hid in my desk and didn't show anyone. But I think the secretary might still remember that scenario. But we didn't do a panel, but that may have protected me a little more.
What did the sign say?
I won't say. There's my face on it and Lloyd Austin's face on it, and I was victorious in this picture. But it really matters to the career staff at OMB that the OMB director fights for what they have advised you. That was the part I didn't appreciate as much. They want to be heard. This advice and counsel that they are there for, there's nothing that gets on their skin more than thinking you have gone across the street to the White House and come back that completely obliterates all advice and counsel that they have given you. And so you march, they give you great advice, and sometimes you come back victorious, and sometimes you're like, we'll win the next one. But I tried to, because I thought they had good advice, and if I didn't love their advice, we went back and forth and came up with a unified. But it was incredibly important to civil servants, and I think cabinet secretaries will say the same thing, that they fight for the prerogatives of their agency for morale, if not for anything else.
Shalanda, I don't know if it was your experience, but I experienced a number of weird ways that the cabinet officers would try to curry favor.
I got cookies.
With the budget director. I got cookies. I got one cabinet officer invited me to lunch in her private dining room with the chef.
That didn't make you feel better, did it?
No.
Yeah.
That was a big mistake.
Yeah. That would have been for me too.
Yeah. I'm thinking, I'm getting my lunch out of the vending machine in the old EOB, and you've got a chef, So that one backfired. The one that worked the best was I think it was Ann Veneman was the Secretary of Agriculture, and she did a video presentation that the cabinet officers were given an opportunity to make an appeal or to make a case to the budget director, and they would always get a meeting if they wanted it. Ann made a video instead, and in the video, it was basically praising me personally, was the whole focus of the video. And so she's sitting at her desk, and as the camera pans out, there are little statues of me around with votive candles and all that kind of stuff. I'm going to guess that did not happen to you.
My kid got some cool NASA swag. I'm not sure it worked, but she still wore it.
Anyway, John, the point is that inside the government, the cabinet officers recognize the significance of the budget office, even if it's not well recognized, and perhaps it's best that it isn't well recognized to the outside world.
You referred a couple of times here, when the system works as it was designed to. We're in a situation where I cannot think of the last time Congress passed individual appropriations
94.
bills.
On time.
On time.
94.
So we don't have report language for, to read congressional intent. We don't have a lot of things. Does that shift the power of the purse from the Hill, which is what it says in the Constitution, to the White House?
I mean, I have pretty strong opinions, so I don't want to, But here's the thing, this idea of we've now figured out these things that are norms that aren't necessarily protected. I expected when I was committee staff and when I became OMB, we treated committee report language as if it was law. Turns out you don't have to if Congress doesn't insist on it. So now Congress has to decide on a bipartisan basis what they're going to do about it. Are they going to do what they did during Nixon and do things together like the Impoundment and Control Act, all those things came out of what they viewed as abuses. So, it is hard to talk about the presidency and this consolidation without talking about a Congress that has refused to answer the moment. Someone asked me recently, like, what would you say to the president and your successor about, the upcoming shutdown? I was like, nothing. The president is the president, and he gets to pick who he wants. I have a lot to say to my former colleagues on the Hill, is what are you going to do to stand up for, the institution of Congress? Partisanship can't be more important than the institution itself, which provides a check. And I think the judiciary is waiting to see and is taking incremental steps to see if Congress is going to step up and take its power back. And so far, they haven't. But I think it's a little bit a shock and awe for all of them. Republicans, Democrats, it doesn't matter. They're trying to figure out how to respond to this moment. First you heard, there are this pocket rescissions, which, by the way, I'd never used that phrase ever in life. These new phrases are coming up. We're going to be really mad. It happens. Are you really mad yet? What are you going to do? What are you going to do? Well, if they send up another one, it's like, come on, guys. So, yeah, I think they're figuring out. I don't know where the point is where you start to see bipartisan movement. The last time there was a bipartisan kind of push to bring some transparency was when I was OMB director. I go, so you do this now when I'm here. That's fine, but it's putting apportionments online, these very powerful documents that OMB uses to really keep the government in line, not just the budget process. Apportionments are probably more important and more of a secretive process. Frankly, a power Congress gave away from itself to the executive branch, and they need to rethink if that was a smart idea long ago. But those are now online, or are supposed to be, and I think they're back online after a court case. But that, I think, is the last kind of pushback bipartisan in an appropriations bill that required these secretive, very important documents to go online so there could be oversight and transparency.
Josh, anything to add?
Well, I think what's in our current environment, the president is, to say the least, pushing the envelope, as Rachel has and Andy and Guillen have all described. But I think the right answer to that is the one that Shalonda was suggesting, which is that the Congress needs to assert its prerogatives. And if the Congress does not assert its prerogatives, the president will continue to encroach on them. You can hold your breath until you turn blue at the president, but the Congress does have these constitutional authorities, and it's up to the Congress to execute them. I mean, the president is always going to push the envelope, but this one has pushed it much farther than any of his predecessors. But the president's always going to push the envelope. The president's always going to wish we had parliamentary rather than divided government. That's just a feature of our system. But the system cannot flourish if one of the three branches is abdicating its responsibilities.
Why don't we open up for questions? I believe there are microphones in the crowd to go around. If anybody, there's a question over here. Kelsey? Or something, you're going to, yeah, I'll let you handle it since you can see more than I can.
Why have they abdicated their responsibilities rather than assert them? You would assume that they would want to. So what's the dynamic that would lead Congress to advocate?
As I've thought about this, who is they? These are individual actors. They get elected from their own districts in the House, state, and the Senate. It is really hard for them to act with one voice as an institutional check or counter to the president, who obviously everyone works for. So I think one, just the setup of Congress being made of these individual CEOs of their own fiefdoms, it is hard to have some institutional action from them. This modern day Congress is certainly has a bigger problem with that. I think that's probably a political answer as to why our politics have drawn them into more partisan gangs instead of institutional. But I think, I would love to hear our founders thinking on, this institution is made up of a bunch of individuals who have their own politics, their own regions. What was the idea of getting them to act with one voice when the presidency's set up? Is lots of problems getting agencies in line, but they're the boss. He or she is the boss. Congress come from these just very varied points of power. I do think they used to act with more institutional protection, but again, I think people who studied the political changes in our country can explain why I think party has trumped, no pun intended, trumped institution.
Can I just add, if Shalonda was a student in my undergraduate political science class, she would have just gotten an A+. Because this is exactly how scholars talk about it, is members of Congress are single-minded seekers of re-election, right? That's what they're doing. They're getting themselves re-elected, and the party is way more useful for them in accomplishing that goal than the institution of Congress itself, whatever that might be.
Right.
Good work.
So it ties
Thank
into broader changes in how people are elected, the primary systems, et cetera, gerrymandering. We can go into all kinds of big picture things that have led to this small, these interactions with the president that are less aggressive than I think many of us would like to see.
Yeah, John, can we, instead of my answering the question, could I ask if I could turn it back to the questioner?
Sure.
Because the person who asked that question is Pete Wehner, who is one of the most incisive observers of our civic culture. Pete, how would you answer your own question?
I'm not exactly. I assume that the dynamics have changed because you had powerful presidents 50 years ago, but Congress was still willing, to stand up institutionally. So I assume that the political incentives and the career incentives had shifted in a way that they make the calculation that opposing the president is going to be more costly to them than standing up to him. So that may come back to the primary process and how things have shifted over time. But it does raise the question then of what practically can be done. Now, maybe the key here is political change that leads to institutional change, which kind of calms the system down and gets it back to equilibrium. But it is striking when you talk to people who have studied this for years, who worked on the Hill, of exactly the point you made, which is they simply are laying down, and that's not how the system was designed. So it's dysregulated right now, and I think it's coming at a cost.
Hi, my name is Sophia. Thank you so much for this fascinating conversation. I write Politico's West Wing Playbook, and my question for both Josh and Shalonda is, with the September 30th deadline, when some of the funds for this fiscal year expire, I mean, have you been in touch with some of your former colleagues on the Hill, some members? I mean, what are they thinking privately? And to your point about they should take action, what should they do specifically? Where should it originate? Should it be a bill? Talk us through a little bit more in specificity of what you're hearing, what needs to be done. Thank you.
Well, one, I thought, after 24 years, I was like free of this, and my mind would go to greener pastures, and it was a famous movie, I Can't Quit You. Every 5 days, I'm like, I'm just done. I'm done. And then I call somebody. I'm like, what are y'all doing? You know, in March, we never shut down in the Biden 4 years, ever. Even through some personal risk with Senate not voting until 1 or 2 in the morning, I probably should have shut it down. Because I'm kind of on the hook if we're spending money and somehow this vote falters at 2 a.m. We should have shut it down at midnight. But it was so important, I thought, to have a 4 years where the budget process did not descend into pure chaos. It was chaos, but maybe let's try to like a reprieve from shutdown. So we did not. So I consider myself, I will look for a deal anywhere. I will look for a middle ground anywhere. No one gets everything they want, ever. I don't understand people who think they, can live in divided government or government this close and they can walk out with their best partisan dreams. I've never understood that. And they know that. They're in the vote no, hope yes caucus. And I say all that to say, in March, enough had happened for me where I was done. And my advice was different than anything I would have ever suggested to people where, I just thought the status quo was so bad that voting for something that allowed the status quo to continue just did not seem feasible. And you have to understand, members then go, well, how do you get out of it? I go, I don't know. I can't tell you. This is not a win-lose thing. This is not game theory. You have to decide. The one thing you have, if you're in the minority, is your vote. That is it. And if you believe that everything's hunky-dory and funding is being used in a way that is okay with your value system, go for it. If you don't, you got one thing, your vote. So that is where I've sat uncomfortably for a few months. I've told lots of members my thinking on the matter. And Democrats like government. They like governing. It is hard for them, just like it's hard for me to say that. But there are parts of the government, in my view, that are shut down and in worse shape than any government shutdown we've ever seen. And I'm not okay with that. So if I'm not okay with that, then how do you find something, you voted for something that you thought was going to be used one way, is being used another way. You now know that, there's enough proof in that, you should get to vote on a bill that you're okay with. And so I think this is going to have lots of back and forth, lots of tears. Again, Democrats like governing. They don't like being in this position. But they have some moral and just hard thinking, and norms have changed in DC, and I think even politicians are trying to catch up with how to respond to the moment. And I don't take this moment lightly. And September 30th, I think it's going to be hard for Democrats to vote for something they've now, even past March, you've now seen rescissions, you've now seen withholding of money that you want to go out. They've tried to call, they've tried to plead, they've tried to work with Republicans to get stuff released. It's just not working. And they are in a position to find a way to at least be heard.
Just a quick, a quick supplemental comment there, which is that in most years we wouldn't be facing a shutdown because the Congress has been doing pretty well in getting the bills done. I go back to the right answer is pass the appropriations bills, do the individual appropriations bills and send them to the president for signature or veto and let the process work its way out. That probably would be happening now, but for the fact that Democrats have been so frustrated with President Trump and some of the things that he's been doing that they don't have any other way to express their anger. So I think this is an anomalous, we're probably going to have a shutdown. I think it's an anomaly because of the politics of the moment, not because of the inherent structure of the relationship between the president and the Congress. And I just add one other footnote, which is that Republicans, at least the White House, goes into this negotiation in a particularly strong place, because I bet the current budget director would not mind a shutdown, because that gives a whole lot of power, as Shalonda knows better than anyone, whole lot of power to the budget director, because there's real ambiguity and flexibility in what continues to get funded, what gets cut off. In a sense, a shutdown may end up being Russ Vought's dream rather than the nightmare that it would have been for either you and me.
I think I'm next over here.
Yes.
Hi. And hello, Shalonda.
Hi, how are you?
Shalonda's part of my new family here. I'd like to ask two we've been in the clouds a bit, but I want to ask two very practical questions. One's to Kian, one's to Rachel. Kian, I have learned over the years that when they created Medicare, that the Social Security Commissioner, Bob Ball, was deeply involved in the creation of the legislation. And that, is that right? Am I right about
Yes,
that? Okay.
yes, it is.
And that was one of the big reasons that Medicare worked fairly smoothly, and it, of course, has been very popular. Do you know of any other examples where the sort of civil service, where the permanent government wing has been involved in creating legislation? Because it seems like that, it strikes me that that was maybe a one-off.
Thinking through possibilities, there are a couple that I would point to. One would be the Nixon administration and the Clean Water and Air Acts, that there was definitely reliance on career civil service, just because you were building a new area of effectively regulation. So you needed, you didn't have that, I guess, the political experience, I would say. So you needed the civil service capacities there. Another, thinking through the details here, but when the Reagan administration, and I say that loosely because it was a very complex process, but the initial implementation of cost controls on Medicare through diagnosis-related groups, where you replaced pure fee-for-service payment, essentially, with an effort at effectively prospective payment. That was another one where you were very much turning to people who were in touch with the latest experiments in healthcare policy, because this came out of models developed, I believe, at Yale, implemented in New Jersey. There were some different variants going on in Maryland. So you needed people that were connected into that world.
Andy, you've got.
Can I just make a very quick addendum, which is to say that OMB, one of its jobs is legislative clearance, right? And so the Legislative Reference Division has the job of effectively making sure that everyone with knowledge in government has a chance to weigh in on the formulation of legislative items in the president's program. So, I mean, I think it's actually quite common for civil servants across the government to be asked. Again, I think that, where that process stands at the moment is a little bit in doubt, whether we're talking about legislation or executive orders, even regulations. But, that has been a valuable function for the president to know what the people in the administration are doing, and also, again, what they know.
And Capitol Hill now insists on this interagency process. It's a good way for chairs on the Hill to turn down legislation from their colleagues. Well, I don't know how the executive branch feels about it. So we did a lot of this clearance, and the Hill wanted it, they wanted to see our red lines. Then they get mad about them.
Okay.
But we did a lot of this interagency clearance on legislation, stuff that never became law. It takes up a lot of time. But it is nice that there was a way, and the Hill really wanted it. That's probably a change. But I think committee chairs use it as a way to not move on things if they don't get feedback from the executive branch.
And for Rachel, Schedule F, do we know how many positions have been converted what that process looks like? Does anybody keeping agency by agency numbers on that? And then what the hell is Schedule G? I mean, I never heard, somebody popped that out the other day, and I have no idea what it is.
I'm not sure anyone knows what Schedule G is, to be honest, because it's not clear how it's very substantively different from Schedule C. So this is an executive order that Trump signed relatively recently, creating a new schedule. So that's Schedule G. I don't know. Maybe Andy has some insight on that one.
I haven't seen implementation of it.
Yeah.
But it would make it easier to make political appointments without getting Senate confirmation. That's the idea behind Schedule G.
Yeah.
But why is it not isn't that Schedule C? I mean, let's go through the alphabet here.
C? Well, C is for, lower level positions in
Right.
principle.
Okay,
You could make
and
political
how about-
SES appointments while we're alphabetizing, yeah.
So, all right, so how about Schedule F?
So
is that
my
happening?
understanding of Schedule F, which is now Schedule PC, is that OPM policy/career, if you're wondering, is OPM proposed rules in April, I think, and so we're waiting for those regulations to be finalized before they start. I've not seen anything public on
Okay, on
numbers.
actual
Beyond the
numbers.
sort of 50,000.
But can I, John, why do you need a Schedule F now that you have proven and the courts have said it's okay to let go of federal workers? Why do you need to convert anyone to a new schedule?
Good point.
Good point. I think
Yeah, I'm not sure the questions about whether you can fire a civil servant without going through the processes that exist. I don't think that's been decided on the merits as yet, right? There are still some lawsuits pending.
John, just to add a point to, Rachel's done terrific work on and raised the alarm about the politicization of the staff at OMB, which I think is a mistake. For many reasons, not least because I think it's unnecessary. The president can exert real control over OMB. You were an OMB staffer, a professional staffer, and with good political leadership, those 500 people will salute and do their best for the country. And so I believe there are places in the government where the bureaucracy resists the leadership of the president. OMB is not one of them, and I think it's not only unnecessary, it's a big mistake because so much expertise resides there that I think in politicizing those appointments, the president undermines his own ability to effectively control the government through OMB because there's a lot less capacity there. I'll say one other thing. The one day that I wish every citizen could be present in the West Wing is January 20th on a 4-year cycle, because it is shocking to see, and many people in this room have seen it. It is shocking to see what happens to the central force of our government. It is totally decapitated. I've been through 2 transitions out and 1 transition in, and you go into the West Wing on January 20th, and there is, until noon, when the new crew shows up, there is no one there. And I'm raising it now and it's a remarkable thing. I think it speaks volumes about the strength of our institutions and our democracy, that we can just decapitate the government in this way, and yet we still manage to go along through what historically have been peaceful and successful transitions. But I'm raising it in the context of OMB because almost the only professional staff left within the gates of the White House complex are those 500 OMB people. Chris Liddell has written a great book called Year Zero, which argues for the importance of setting up the management structures early on, and the politicization of the OMB staff, which are really the only staff that is there during with any expertise during a transition. The politicization of that, I think, makes the moment one of even greater peril.
I'll also recommend Dave Marchick's book on presidential transitions, also in the series and
Same.
available in the lobby.
Same.
I've got the mic over here. Phil Wallach, American Enterprise Institute. Forgive me, I'm going to rant just a little bit. You talked about really learning the difference between laws and norms as we've got an administration in the White House that is willing to just disregard norms. I would say we shouldn't lose sight of how much laws have become optional, and the law has become only one of several paths to get what you want. Over not just the Trump administration, but the last 15 years, more generally. You go back to the House of Representatives trying to say this part of Obamacare, as it's written, is going to grind to a halt. We're not going to appropriate you any money for it, and let's see what happens. And the administration says, okay, we'll take the money from other places. The House of Representatives sued. U.S. House of Representatives versus Burwell. They were winning victories in court, and yet the money was spent. The real action is in the OMB. Forgive me if I don't take the joke that this session started with as entirely funny. Maybe the real action in government is at the OMB, not on Capitol Hill. If we look at the first Trump administration saying, I'm going to go into this appropriations negotiation trying to get wall money, right? And actually, I'm going to be willing to shut the government down until we can work something out on that. Oh, and how am I going to end that? I'm just going to end by saying I'm entitled to ignore Congress. I'm going to end this shutdown and say I'm going to reschedule the money that I have from other sources. I'm going to use it for wall funding. Go ahead and sue me. If we look at the Biden administration, how they approach the student loan stuff, right? A hundreds of billions of dollar program that they decided not to run through Congress because they found ways of taking a statute that was on the books and running with it. So of course, that's different than appropriations, forgiving loans. But gosh, it seems like there's a sort of rising trend of viewing the law as sort of something that's pretty tweakable, something you can get around, and something you ultimately don't need to rely on. And so that means if you're an appropriator on Capitol Hill, laboring on this year in, year out process, trying to keep things on a give and take basis, well, sometimes you might just say, is this really the real action? The chair of the Appropriations Committee, Tom Cole of Oklahoma, was asked, why are you letting DOJ do all this stuff? Isn't this Congress's job? And he said, well, yeah, it's Congress's job, but Congress doesn't always do its job. So am I going to get bent out of shape when the administration is saving some money on some programs that Republicans don't like anyway? No, I'm not going to get bent out of shape about it. I'm going to make sure that Oklahoma gets taken care of by having back channels with the OMB, where the real action is. And yeah, they listen to him because they'd rather not pick a fight. But it does seem to me that we shouldn't lose sight of just how much we've shifted to a mindset in politics where, yeah, the real action is in the White House at OMB, and maybe the stuff that happens on Capitol Hill is just a sideshow. That's a comment. I would love to hear any of your any of your reaction.
I mean, I think we've agreed.
Yeah.
I think the first question, asked why Congress allows this, and I think Tom Cole, he also said appropriations aren't laws, so I can't square that. And I love Tom Cole. And they have to decide, something has to give for them to have a different response than that, and I don't know what that is. But, the first two examples you cited, I was a new staff director during this border wall negotiation. we all kind of knew that was in the background. Like Mitch McConnell changed his talking. He knew there was no other way to deal with the president other than to say, fine, do your national emergency. Now, whether I liked it or not, he beat us in court. The courts mostly said, sure, Congress lets you set this national emergency, and we'll do it. So part of what we have to, I think we're coming to realization, not just, you're right, this administration, but others, administrations are going to look for ways to use laws that they think they can win in court. And we didn't envision national emergencies to be used that way, but turns out they can be. And future presidents will use them that way now that you can. Apportionments. Apportionments have, been used in different ways than envisioned. Congress has to decide then, should we have given the right for OMB to micromanage our appropriations through these apportionments in that way? Now, when you have overreach, Congress then has to decide whether they gave too much up. And I think we're all in this presidency conference trying to figure out how to shake Congress loose to take some of its power back on a lot of these fronts. But I could have had the same rant. Every president thinks that they don't have a bureaucracy or a government responsive to them. And I watch this and I've joked with people, this administration frustrates me and part of me is jealous.
This seems like the right forum to quote Martha Durthick, longtime faculty member at University of Virginia, who 20 years ago said that a lot of the action in policymaking is not in passing new law, but in finding new meaning in old law. And I think presidents, partly helped by OMB, have been very creative in doing just that.
I think I need to call time. I think we're at the end of our time here. Gian, Shalonda, Andy, Rebecca, Josh, thank you very much.